He had no idea that an ordinary day in the jungle would change his life forever. Deep in the heart of the Amazon, he stumbled upon an old abandoned train, in a place where there shouldn't have been any roads or tracks at all. But when he stepped inside and saw what had been hidden there for over 100 years, he realized that some secrets are better left to the forest god. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The jungle was not a place for men who feared silence. It breathed slowly, endlessly, swallowing every sound that dared to rise above its pulse. For Elias, silence was not an absence, it was a language. He had lived long enough in the heart of the Amazon to understand its cadences, its pauses, its whispers before rain. The rustle of leaves was not merely wind, but warning. The distant caw of a toucan was not noise, but direction. Every evening, as the crimson light dissolved behind the dense canopy, he would listen, and in that listening he found peace that most men could not bear. His hut stood near the curve of a muddy river, built from the same wood that surrounded him. The air inside smelled of oil, smoke, and damp maps. A small radio sat on a wooden shelf beside an old lantern. Most nights it was his only companion, muttering fragments of news and songs from faraway towns he no longer cared to visit. His dog, Tupa, a lean creature with a coat as dark as the soil after rain, often slept by the doorway, keeping one ear half lifted for the cries of night creatures. Together they existed in a rhythm of solitude that had become their entire world. Elias worked for the Environmental Patrol, a thin thread of bureaucracy stretched deep into the wilderness. His task was simple in words, but endless in execution. To walk, to watch, to record. He checked logging permits, marked illegal camps, noted fires, and reported violations through a radio signal that rarely reached beyond the trees. The pay was modest, the risks constant, but for a man who had long ago turned away from cities, this was enough. In the forest, he was invisible, and invisibility, he had learned, was a kind of freedom. The storm had come 3 nights before, a wall of water and wind that made even the strongest trees groan. When it passed, it left the air swollen with humidity and the earth heavy underfoot. Fallen trunks blocked familiar trails. Branches, heavy with water, hung low like curtains. On the morning after, when he checked the satellite images sent to his office terminal, a battered old laptop powered by a sputtering generator, something unusual caught his eye. In the endless green blur of the map, there was a line. Not a river, not a ridge. Straight, impossibly straight, cutting through several kilometers of forest. He zoomed in, frowning. The image was grainy, but the line remained. It was too even to be natural. He had seen similar patterns near abandoned mining operations where men once carved scars into the earth. But this area was supposed to be untouched. No concessions, no access roads, no records of exploration. Elias rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the sweat gather there. Curiosity was dangerous in the Amazon. It led people too far. But the image pulled at him with quiet insistence. That night, as rain tapped gently against the roof of his hut, he unfolded a topographic map and traced the coordinates with his finger. The region lay deep beyond any official trail, 3 days of walking at least. His orders didn't require him to go there, yet the habit of duty and the itch of curiosity joined hands in his mind. Perhaps it was a landslide. Perhaps illegal loggers had opened a path. Perhaps it was nothing but the satellite's error. Still, he decided, he would go. He packed lightly, a machete, a coil of rope, a small compass, dried meat, water tablets, and his old Nikon camera. In the corner, Tupa lifted his head as if reading his thoughts. The dog's tail moved once, slow and uncertain. Elias crouched and scratched behind his ears. "You stay," he murmured. "Guard the house." The dog whined softly but obeyed. Before dawn, Elias stepped into the dripping darkness. The forest received him without ceremony. Each step sank into moist soil, releasing the smell of decay that only the jungle could make beautiful. The trail at first was familiar, a narrow corridor between colossal trunks wrapped in vines, but soon it dissolved, replaced by the unbroken texture of wilderness. He cut through it patiently, his machete swinging with rhythm. The air grew heavier as the sun rose. It was a heat that didn't burn, but suffocated, pressing against his lungs. Mosquitoes followed in a black cloud. By midday, he reached a clearing formed by fallen trees, victims of the storm. The sudden open sky above him felt almost unnatural. He stopped to drink, sitting on a log slick with moss. Around him, the forest buzzed and whispered, alive with unseen movements. He took out his compass, aligned his path with the coordinates he had written on a strip of paper, and continued east. The ground began to change. It sloped upward, the vegetation thickened, and the roots of the trees twisted like serpents, trying to trip him. Now and then he thought he saw fragments of something metallic half buried in the mud. A piece of pipe, maybe an old drum left by prospectors. But when he brushed them clean, they seemed older, shaped by hands that didn't belong to this century. He photographed one piece, marked the spot, and moved on. By the second day, fatigue set in. His boots were soaked, his shirt clung to his skin, and his arms itched from insect bites. Yet something urged him forward, some quiet conviction that whatever lay ahead had been waiting a very long time for someone to find it. That evening, he made camp by a small stream, hung his hammock between two sturdy trees, and ate in silence. He stared at the faint glow of the fire and listened to the forest's endless murmur. There was comfort in that sound, but also warning. The Amazon was generous to those who respected it, merciless to those who didn't. On the third morning, he woke before sunrise. A thin mist floated above the ground, turning the trees into pillars of ghostly silver. The compass needle trembled as he checked his direction. He was close now, perhaps a few kilometers away from the point he had marked. The forest seemed to resist his passage. Thick roots blocked his steps. Vines caught his arms like living ropes. Sweat ran into his eyes, blurring his vision. Then, as he cut through one last curtain of hanging moss, the air changed. The smell of earth and rot gave way to something metallic, faint but unmistakable. He paused, heart beating faster. Ahead of him, through the veil of vines, the green darkness seemed to open into a hollow space. He pushed forward, the machete slicing through the leaves, until suddenly the forest ended, and something impossible rose before him. It was a wall of iron, eaten by rust, covered in moss and strangled by roots. For a heartbeat, he thought it was a cliff, a natural formation tinted red by minerals, but then he saw it. A wheel, half buried in soil, a window rim, a piece of handrail still intact. Elias took a step back, eyes wide. It was not a wall, it was a machine. He stood motionless, listening. The jungle had fallen silent around him as if holding its breath. The shape loomed massive and ancient, its edges softened by decades of rain. A locomotive, he realized. A train. Out here, where there were no tracks, no roads, no record of human passage. His mind refused to accept it. Slowly he approached, touching the corroded metal. It was warm under the sun, rough and alive with the tiny movements of ants and vines. He traced the outline of a number plate so eroded that only fragments remained. Something like Hanover, 1910. The letters meant little, but the implication struck him like a wave. German, early 20th century. He whispered the year aloud and felt it vanish into the humid air. Elias stepped back to take in the full sight. The engine stood tilted to one side as if the earth beneath had swallowed half of it. Behind it stretched two cars, their roofs broken, their sides devoured by roots as thick as arms. The forest had not merely hidden the train, it had tried to digest it. Trees grew through the windows, ferns sprouted from the boiler. It looked less like a relic than like a skeleton reclaimed by nature. He took out his camera, hands trembling slightly, and began to photograph from different angles. The lens fogged again and again from the moisture, forcing him to wipe it with his sleeve. He circled the locomotive, every step sinking into the soft ground, feeling the strange vibration of awe and disbelief mingling in his chest. How could this be here? No map mentioned a railway within hundreds of kilometers. No elder he had met in nearby villages ever spoke of one. The discovery both exhilarated and unsettled him. He felt as though he had trespassed upon something sacred, something the forest had chosen to forget. When the sun began to sink, casting red light across the tangled metal, Elias sat on a stone and stared at the train for a long time. He thought of the men who had built it, of the journey it must have taken, of how it had come to rest here, abandoned and devoured. He could almost hear the distant hiss of steam, the rhythmic clank of wheels on rails that no longer existed. As night crept in, the shadows thickened and the jungle regained its voice. Crickets sang, frogs croaked, branches cracked far away. Elias felt the fatigue in his body return, but his mind refused to rest. He knew he had found something extraordinary, yet also something that demanded silence. He built a small fire at the edge of the clearing, far enough not to touch the vines that crawled across the meadow. The flames painted the locomotive in flickering orange light, making it seem alive again for an instant. He sat there, knees drawn to his chest, and thought about the straight line he had seen on the satellite image, the scar that had led him here. Perhaps it had been the railway itself, long buried beneath layers of soil. Perhaps tomorrow he would follow it to see where it ended. But another thought came to him, quieter and heavier. What if this was the end already? What if the forest had erased the rest long ago, keeping this fragment as a memory, a whisper from a century past? The fire burned low. The night deepened. Elias closed his eyes and let the sounds of the jungle lull him into uneasy sleep. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the curve of the iron wheel glinting faintly in the firelight, like an eye half open, watching. And in that breathless heart of the Amazon, surrounded by the endless breadth of trees, he felt the weight of discovery settle upon him, a mixture of wonder, disbelief, and a sense that the forest, vast and patient, had finally chosen to show him one of its oldest secrets. He didn't yet know that this was only the beginning. When Elias awoke, the air was still heavy with the smell of damp soil and rust. Morning light filtered weakly through the leaves above, breaking into trembling patches of gold that danced across the corroded surface of the locomotive. For a few seconds he lay still in his hammock, half believing the train had been part of a dream born of exhaustion and fever. But then he saw it again, unmoving and colossal, its body entangled with roots and moss, a monument both real and impossible. He rose slowly, his muscles aching from the previous day's march. The fire had long gone out, leaving only a trace of smoke that curled upward like a thread vanishing into the canopy. His first instinct was to record everything before the humidity could ruin his equipment. The camera clicked again and again as he circled the locomotive. Every step revealed new details. the shattered glass of a lamp, the twisted railing that once guided passengers, the faint outline of a door now sealed by vines. The silence around him was uncanny. The jungle usually hummed with life at dawn. The screech of macaws, the chatter of monkeys, the whisper of insects. But here, near this monstrous relic, even the air seemed to hold its breath. Elias could hear only the slow beating of his own heart and the distant murmur of water somewhere beyond the trees. He felt the weight of centuries pressing against his skin. He approached the massive wheel embedded in the ground, kneeling to examine the layers of soil and roots that had swallowed half of it. The metal, when brushed with his hand, left a reddish stain like dried blood. He followed the contour upward until he reached the side panel of the engine. There, almost hidden under moss, a rectangular plaque caught the light. He cleaned it carefully with his knife and read the few letters that remained. Work Hanover, 1910. The engraving was faint, eroded by rain, yet it told him more than he could comprehend. The number confirmed what his instincts had whispered the night before. This train was not Brazilian. Its origin lay across the ocean, in an era when steam still ruled and the world believed in the conquest of nature. But here it was, alone and forgotten, stranded in the very heart of the jungle where no rails had ever existed. He stepped back and looked at the terrain. No trace of tracks, no gravel, no embankment, nothing that could suggest a railway. The earth was uneven, dense with roots and shrubs. If there had once been a line, the forest had consumed it entirely. Elias began to move slowly around the perimeter, searching for any pattern that might explain its presence. He found only fragments. A piece of pipe buried in the mud, a corroded hook, the outline of what might have been a coupling rod. All of it eaten by time. As the sun climbed higher, the humidity grew unbearable. Sweat trickled down his neck and mosquitoes attacked every inch of exposed skin. He forced himself to keep working, measuring distances, taking photographs, sketching a rough map in his notebook. Each time he stopped to rest, he found his eyes drifting back to the locomotive, as if drawn by some invisible gravity. By midday, he had finished the circuit. The entire structure stretched longer than he had first imagined. 2 passenger cars behind the engine, both collapsed inward where the roofs had given way. One of the cars leaned heavily to one side, half swallowed by a mound of earth, as though the forest itself had pulled it down in slow revenge. The other stood almost upright, its windows broken, its frame wrapped in vines so thick they looked like cables binding a prisoner. Elias approached cautiously, testing each step on the soft ground. The air inside the broken doorway was cooler, almost stagnant. The smell that reached him was a mixture of mold, oil, and something older, a scent like forgotten wood. He hesitated only a moment before ducking inside. The interior was a corridor of decay. Shafts of sunlight pierced through holes in the roof, illuminating clouds of dust that shimmered like mist. Rows of seats lined the sides, their leather torn and curling like dry leaves. Metal racks for luggage hung crookedly, some twisted down by the weight of vines that had grown through them. A spider scuttled across the remains of a cushion as he passed. He tried to imagine the people who had once sat here, the sound of their conversations mingling with the hiss of steam and the rumble of wheels. Now there was only silence, broken by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. His boots made no sound on the damp floor, as if the very wood refused to echo. At the far end of the car, something glinted beneath a layer of debris. Elias knelt and brushed away the dirt. A small metal frame emerged, perhaps part of a sign. Inside it, fragments of faded paper clung to the backen. The words were almost gone, but he could still decipher a few. Fireplan, Berlin, and a series of numbers that looked like dates. He swallowed hard. German again. He slipped the fragment into his pack, careful not to damage it further. Then he moved to the next car, climbing over a fallen section of wall. The second carriage was darker, its windows completely sealed by vegetation. He had to use his flashlight to see. The beam revealed chaos, overturned benches, piles of soil and roots, the skeleton of a bird trapped long ago. He felt a chill despite the heat. Halfway through the car, the floor sagged dangerously. He crouched low, balancing his weight, and spotted something metallic lodged between two boards. It was a circular gauge, perhaps from the engine's control system, with its needle frozen at 0. The glass was cracked but intact enough for him to read the word damp, steam. He turned it over in his hands, marveling at the craftsmanship, then set it back where he had found it. When he finally stepped outside again, the sun was beginning to fall behind the trees. The jungle's voices returned slowly, as if assured that the intruder meant no harm. Parrots screamed somewhere overhead, and the monotonous whine of cicadas filled the air. Elias wiped his forehead and sat on a rock facing the locomotive. He tried to reason it out. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps a transport operation during the old rubber boom, a plan to build a railway that failed halfway through construction. Maybe the train had been shipped in pieces and abandoned when the project collapsed. Yet even that seemed improbable. No record, no local memory, no trace of such an enterprise existed. And how could such massive machinery have been brought here without a path? He remembered the old men in the nearby villages, their stories of foreign explorers who came seeking plants and riches and vanished into the jungle. Perhaps this was their legacy, or perhaps, he thought uneasily, it was simply a mistake, a monument to human arrogance swallowed by the land it sought to conquer. The light softened to amber. He took one last photograph of the train bathed in the setting sun, the rays catching on the metal like fire. It looked almost alive, as though it might shudder and breathe at any moment. Then he packed his things. The forest was not a place to spend 2 nights in the same camp. That evening, he moved a short distance away and built a new fire under a massive tree. The flames cast shifting shadows across the bark, and through the gaps he could still glimpse the silhouette of the locomotive, half hidden, half revealed. He ate a little dried meat, drank sparingly from his canteen, and wrote brief notes in his log. His handwriting trembled slightly as he described the discovery. When he looked up again, darkness had swallowed everything beyond the reach of the fire. The sounds of the night were louder now: frogs, insects, the rustle of unseen wings. Somewhere close, a jaguar roared once, deep and resonant. Elias tightened his grip on the machete beside him, though he knew the beast would not come near the firelight. Sleep came fitfully. Images drifted through his mind: the curved iron wheel, the eroded plaque, the silent corridor of seats. He dreamed of men in uniforms speaking a language he did not understand, of smoke curling above green hills, of rails stretching endlessly through the forest before vanishing into mist. At dawn, he woke shivering despite the heat. A thin fog clung to the ground, and the air tasted of rain. He packed quickly, casting one last glance at the clearing where the train waited. For the first time, it seemed smaller, less like a relic of another world, and more like a patient creature enduring its burial. The forest had begun its work again overnight. Vines had shifted slightly, Leaves had fallen across the roof. Nature wasted no time reclaiming what was hers. He turned away and began retracing his steps, though he knew he would not go far. He intended to reach a ridge he had passed the previous day, where he could get a signal strong enough to send coordinates to the nearest station. He needed confirmation, maps, archives, anything that might tell him whether what he had found was part of some forgotten chapter of history. As he walked, he thought of the line he had seen on the satellite image. Could it have been a trace of old railway beds? If so, perhaps the remains of bridges or tunnels still lay hidden nearby. He decided to return in a few days better prepared with more tools and time. The forest did not reveal its secrets easily. It demanded patience and respect. By the time he reached the ridge, the mist had lifted. He climbed onto a rock, wiped the sweat from his eyes, and turned on the small radio device used for field reports. The signal cracked, caught, and then cleared enough for him to send a brief message. Unidentified structure located. Possible early 20th century origin. Coordinates attached. Static answered him, then a faint voice from the other end. Copy that, Elias. Confirm. Structure? Human-made? Yes, he said after a pause. Very human-made. He signed off and sat in silence for a long time, staring back toward the endless green that hid the train from sight. The discovery filled him with both pride and unease. He felt as though he had opened a door that had been meant to remain closed, and behind it was not mystery, but memory. Someone's forgotten dream, rusting in the heart of the world. That evening, as he returned to his hut by the river, the sky turned violet and the first stars appeared above the treetops. Tupa barked once in greeting, wagging his tail, but Elias barely noticed. He washed his face in the water, sat on the porch, and replayed the day in his mind. He could still see the train whenever he closed his eyes, its shadow etched against the light, its silence louder than any sound the jungle could make. He knew he would go back. Curiosity was no longer curiosity. It was a calling. Something in that rusted mass demanded to be understood. But he also knew that understanding might come at a price, the kind the jungle always exacted from those who asked too much. The night deepened, and far away thunder rolled across the horizon. Elias watched the lightning flash above the canopy, illuminating for an instant the outlines of trees that stretched toward infinity. He wondered if, beneath that endless roof of leaves, the train waited as it had for a century, unmoved and untouched, while the forest slowly, patiently, continued to write its own story over the bones of steel. The rain returned before dawn, a fine mist at first, then a steady downpour that turned the world into liquid shadow. Elias lay awake, listening to the roof of his hut drum with water, thinking of the train buried in green silence. He could see it as clearly as if it stood just beyond his window, the curved flank of the boiler, the broken windows, the vines coiling through the iron bones. He had sent his report, but no one had replied. Perhaps the message had been lost in static, or perhaps the people at the district office had chosen to ignore it, dismissing it as another one of his solitary exaggerations. Either way, the silence from the other side of the radio only deepened his resolve. When the rain eased, he packed his gear once again. This time he added a stronger flashlight, a notebook sealed in plastic, a measuring tape, and a small crowbar. His curiosity had hardened into purpose. He no longer went merely as a patrolman fulfilling duty, but as a man who had found a question too large to ignore. He wanted to see every bolt, every marking, every hidden chamber. He wanted to know how something so immense could exist without a trace of history. The journey back was slower than before, the forest even heavier with water. Streams overflowed, forcing him to wade waist-deep through muddy currents. The air smelled of wet leaves and fermenting fruit. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the green became, until the canopy shut out the sky entirely, and all sense of time dissolved. Yet, even through exhaustion, his anticipation grew. He felt he was returning to something that belonged partly to him now, as though the forest had permitted him alone to see it. When, at last, the ground began to slope upward, he knew he was near. The smell of rust came before the sight, the same faint tang of metal mingled with moss. Then, through the dripping vines, the locomotive appeared again, crouched in its hollow like a creature at rest. The storm had changed it. New leaves clung to its sides and puddles filled the cavities of its roof. The forest was reclaiming it piece by piece, but its bulk remained defiant, an iron ghost refusing to vanish. Elias stood for a moment at the edge of the clearing, feeling a strange reverence. He could have sworn that the air itself was thicker here, the humidity mixed with something almost electrical. He stepped forward, his boots sinking into the soft ground, and placed his hand on the side of the boiler. It was warm, not from fire, of course, but from the sun trapped in metal. The sensation was oddly alive. He climbed the narrow ladder, testing each rung before trusting it with his weight. Some crumbled under his grip, flakes of rust falling like red dust onto the earth below. The entrance to the driver's cab yawned open, black and silent. He switched on his flashlight and ducked inside. The beam caught the gleam of water on metal, the shine of a gauge frozen in place, the outline of a chair that had long since rotted away. Everything was in ruin, yet the arrangement was unmistakable. Here had been the levers of control, the brass handles dulled by time, the furnace door still closed as if waiting for coal. He moved the light slowly over the walls and found patches where paint still clung, a faded green, almost invisible beneath mold. A spider had built its web across one of the pressure dials. A frog leapt from a puddle on the floor. Nature had not merely entered this place, it had made it home. In the corner, under the collapsed edge of the roof, he found a small box half buried in soil. He cleared it with his hands. It was made of metal, once polished, now eaten through in places. When he pried it open, a puff of stale air escaped, smelling of oil and damp paper. Inside lay fragments of what must have been tools, wrenches, bolts, a small hammer, all fused together by rust. Among them, something caught the light. A thin metal tag attached to a chain. He rubbed it clean enough to read a single word stamped into its surface. Maschinenführer, engineer. The letters were German again. He stared at them for a long time, thinking of the man who must have worn that tag, of the hands that once held these tools. He left the cab and made his way along the length of the engine toward the first passenger car. The door resisted at first, sealed by a century of roots, but with a few blows from the crowbar it groaned open. The smell was worse inside. Mildew, rust, and something almost sweet, like old wood turned to rot. The beam of his flashlight revealed a narrow aisle lined with seats, their upholstery long since devoured. Ferns grew from the cracks in the floor. He brushed aside a hanging vine and entered carefully, one step at a time. The light played across the ceiling, where wooden beams bowed under the weight of soil and water. Every so often a droplet fell, echoing sharply in the enclosed space. On one wall he found remnants of wallpaper, a floral pattern, delicate and pale, absurdly elegant for this wilderness. He paused before it, imagining the passengers who had once sat here, their hands gloved, their voices speaking a language foreign to this land. What had they expected to find when they journeyed into the green heart of the world? Near the center of the car, he stumbled upon a suitcase fused to the floor by rust. Its leather had hardened to the texture of bark. He struck it lightly with the crowbar until the clasp gave way. Inside were only scraps, a few buttons, a piece of cloth, and a notebook too fragile to touch. The cover bore no name, only a faint embossed crest. The pages were stuck together, dark with moisture. He took a photograph before closing it again, unwilling to destroy it further. The deeper he explored, the stronger his sense of unease became. Not fear exactly, but awareness of trespass. The forest had clearly decided to claim this place, and he was an intruder in its reclamation. Still, he pressed on, driven by the need to understand. At the far end of the carriage, near a collapsed door, something metallic protruded from the wall. He brushed away the debris and revealed another plaque. This one bore a sequence of numbers, followed by a word that seemed to have been painted later in crude letters: Versuchslinie, experimental line. He stood in silence, the flashlight trembling in his hand. Experimental line. What could that mean? Was this train a prototype? A test of machinery or routes? If so, why bring it here, into a jungle where no track could survive a season? The questions multiplied, heavy as the humid air pressing on his chest. He left the passenger car and stepped into the open again, breathing deeply. The air outside felt alive, rich with the scent of rain-soaked plants. Overhead, the sky had cleared to a dull gray, and sunlight slanted through the canopy and broken columns. He walked around the side of the locomotive, studying the ground. The soil bore no sign of rails, yet just beyond the engine's tail he noticed something unusual. A narrow depression running straight for several meters before vanishing into a tangle of roots. He crouched beside it, tracing its line with his fingers. Beneath the moss lay something hard. He dug with his knife until metal shone through. A rail, only one, corroded and broken. So the line had existed once, however briefly. The realization sent a thrill through him, but it also deepened the mystery. If this was truly a railway, it had been erased with astonishing completeness. He followed the trace as far as he could, losing it after 10 meters where the earth rose sharply. Whatever path had once connected this machine to civilization was gone forever. By late afternoon, exhaustion forced him to stop. He sat on a fallen log facing the locomotive. It loomed over him, immense and inert, its blackened body streaked with rivulets of orange rust. He felt both awe and sorrow. The forest had devoured this creation, but had also preserved it. As if recognizing in it a worthy adversary, it had not destroyed the train completely. It had absorbed it into its own body, turning iron into soil, steam into silence. As evening descended, Elias built a small campfire near the edge of the clearing. The flames flickered in the metal reflection, and for an instant the old machine seemed to glow from within, like a heart briefly remembering how to beat. He sat beside the fire, recording his observations in the notebook. His handwriting was steady, but his mind restless. Each detail he wrote, the German words, the year, the fragments of track, raised more questions than it answered. He thought again of the engineer's tag. Whoever had worked this engine must have lived here for some time. There would have been a crew, supplies, perhaps even a camp nearby, but he had seen no other trace of habitation, no ruins, no tools, no bones, only the train itself, monumental and alone. He fell silent, listening to the jungle. The night chorus rose around him, insects, frogs, the distant rumble of thunder. Yet beneath it all he imagined another sound, faint and impossible, The rhythmic clank of wheels, the hiss of steam. It was not a haunting, he told himself, only memory taking shape in his mind. But it was so vivid that, for a moment, he half expected the headlamp of the locomotive to flare to life. Instead, a single drop of water fell from the boiler onto the fire, hissing into steam, and the spell broke. He laughed softly, embarrassed by his own imagination. He poured a little water over the fire until only embers glowed and then lay back on his mat, staring at the stars that peeked through the canopy. Before sleep took him, he thought of how strange it was that something built by men, meant to conquer distance and connect worlds, could end up here, stranded in silence. Perhaps that was the natural order of things, human ambition reaching too far, the earth answering with patience. The forest had time. It always won in the end. In the last flicker of consciousness, Elias resolved that tomorrow he would venture further. He would search for any remains of the line, any sign of the people who had brought this iron beast into the jungle. He did not yet know what he hoped to find: truth, history, or simply understanding. But the pull of the mystery was stronger than reason. The forest whispered above him and the great locomotive slept on, its body slowly sinking deeper into the soil, the years wrapping around it like layers of green cloth. Time had devoured it, yes, but in doing so had granted it a strange kind of immortality. And Elias, though he could not yet name it, felt that by finding it, he too had been caught in its long, unbroken silence. The following days dragged across Elias's mind like the slow turning of the river near his cabin, steady, patient, and impossible to escape. He could not concentrate on his routine inspections or the minor paperwork that came through the radio. Every morning, as the sunlight broke through the mist and scattered over the water, his thoughts returned to the train sleeping in the forest. Its iron shape seemed etched behind his eyelids, so that even when he tried to focus on other things, measuring tree density, checking animal tracks, he found himself lost again in memory. The locomotive had become more than a discovery. It was a question that hummed under his skin. At night, he sat on the porch, listening to the insects, reading over his notes. He had written every observation he could recall, the year stamped on the plaque, the German words, the fragments of track, the pattern of the corrosion. But none of it explained how a machine of that size and complexity had reached the center of the Amazon without leaving behind a road, a bridge, a story. There were moments when he even doubted his own senses. Could the forest have tricked him? Had the years of solitude warped his perception? Yet the photographs were there, undeniable. The gleam of rust, the shape of the wheels, the broken windows. It was real, and because it was real, he needed to understand. He decided to return to town. The nearest settlement was 3 days away by river, a journey he rarely made unless necessity demanded it. He left early one morning, paddling the small wooden canoe through the narrow channels where the water reflected only sky and leaves. Birds flashed overhead in streaks of red and blue. The forest along the riverbanks leaned close, whispering in languages that predated memory. As the current widened, he felt the strange unease of leaving a living world behind for one made by men. The town was little more than a cluster of wooden houses, a school, a market, and a single building that served as both municipal office and archive. Its streets smelled of wet earth and smoke. People nodded politely to Elias as he passed. They knew him as a quiet inspector who preferred the company of trees. He greeted them with a half smile but wasted no time. His goal lay in the dim room behind the office where the old maps and ledgers were kept. The archivist, an elderly man named Roberto, looked up from his desk with mild surprise. "You again, Elias?" I thought the forest had swallowed you." "Not yet," Elias said. "I need your help." Roberto gestured to the shelves that lined the walls, filled with rolls of brittle paper and dust-covered folders. "Then you come to the right tomb." Elias explained what he had found in careful terms, avoiding any hint of speculation. He spoke of an abandoned locomotive, German manufacturing, a date around 1910, and the absence of any known railway in that region. Roberto listened, his eyebrows rising a little higher with each detail. When Elias finished, the old man sighed and leaned back in his chair. "There were rumors, you know," he said slowly. "A long time ago, before I was born even. Stories about foreign engineers. They came up the river with crates of machines, talking about building something in the interior. Most people thought they were mad. Too much jungle, too much rain. The land eats everything here. Some said they were looking for minerals. Others said they were scientists studying plants. Then the war came, and the world forgot." Elias leaned forward. "Do we have records, names, anything?" Roberto shrugged. "If they ever filed papers, they're gone. Fires, floods, careless hands. History here doesn't like to stay still." He stood and shuffled to a cabinet, opening drawers with the slow precision of habit. "But I'll show you something." From a stack of yellowed maps, he pulled one that looked older than the rest. Its edges were torn, and the ink had bled into the fibers. "This is from 1913, he said, "drawn by a German surveyor who worked for a trading company. See here, these red markings?" He pointed to a faint line that ran parallel to the river before disappearing into the green emptiness of the interior. He called it a proposed route. "Projet Eisenbahnlinie," it says, but there's no evidence it was ever built. Elias traced the line with his finger. It led almost exactly to the coordinates where he had found the train. A chill passed through him, not of fear, but of recognition. The map was proof, fragile, partial proof, but enough to confirm that he had not imagined the impossible. He spent the rest of the day combing through the archives, turning pages that crumbled at his touch. He found letters written in Portuguese and German, contracts for logging rights, vague references to a scientific expedition sponsored by a foreign foundation. One letter mentioned transport of equipment by modular assembly, words that hinted the machinery might have been brought in pieces. But there was no final report, no record of completion or failure. It was as if the project had dissolved into the jungle, erased from paper and memory alike. That night, Elias stayed at a small guest house near the river. He lay awake, listening to rain pattering on the tin roof, his mind replaying every detail of what he had learned. A railway that had begun but never finished. A company lost to time. A group of foreigners who vanished. He thought of the tag he had found in the cab, Maschinenführer, and imagined the man who wore it, sweating in the tropical heat, perhaps writing letters home that never reached their destination. The next morning, he sought out an old geographer who lived on the outskirts of town, a retired professor named Almeida who had spent decades mapping the Amazon's interior. The man's house was a chaos of maps, globes, and books stacked to the ceiling. When Elias described his discovery, Almeida listened in silence, puffing on a long pipe that filled the air with a sweet, heavy smoke. "A German train, you say?" he murmured at last. "It's not as strange as it sounds. In the early 20th century, the Germans had great interest here. Rubber, minerals, pharmaceuticals. They sent scientists and engineers disguised as traders. But the jungle, it does not forgive arrogance. Many of them vanished. The records you seek might have been deliberately buried. After the Great War, no one wanted to admit how far their reach had extended. Elias absorbed the words without comment. The idea that the locomotive could be the remnant of a secret enterprise fascinated him, yet also filled him with a sense of futility. Even if he uncovered every clue, the truth might remain forever entangled in politics and decay. Still, he asked the old man if he knew anyone who could translate the German documents he had photographed. Almeida gave him the address of a linguist in the city. He spent another day preparing copies of his photographs and notes, packing them carefully into a waterproof bag. Before leaving, he walked once more to the edge of the town where the jungle began. The trees stood like a wall, thick and unyielding. Somewhere beyond them, the train waited in its hollow, the engineer's tag resting where he had left it. He felt the pull again, an almost physical need to return. But reason told him to finish his research first. The forest would not move. It had waited a century. He could afford a few weeks to gather answers, so he boarded the riverboat that connected the small town to the distant city, a journey of 2 days downstream. As the vessel glided over brown water, he watched the jungle recede into the distance, a vast and indifferent witness. In the city, everything felt too loud, too bright. Cars honked, vendors shouted, and the air smelled of exhaust instead of rain. Elias moved through it like a ghost, carrying his photographs to the university. The linguist, a young woman named Dr. Weber, examined them with fascination. She confirmed what he already suspected. The markings were German, early 20th century. The term Versuchslinie, she explained, meant experimental line or test track. It implied an engineering project, perhaps testing locomotives under extreme conditions. But why here? Elias asked. She shrugged. The Amazon was the last frontier then. They believed it could yield both wealth and knowledge. Perhaps they wanted to prove that their technology could conquer even this. He left her office with mixed feelings. Conquest, that was the word that lingered. He could almost feel the arrogance of those long-dead engineers, men who thought they could carve rails through a living wilderness and bend it to their will. The forest had answered by swallowing their work whole. Back at his guest house, Elias spread the map and letters on the table. The red line on the map seemed to glow under the lamplight, leading directly into the place that now existed only as memory. He wondered how many lives had been lost there, how many dreams had rusted into silence. He imagined the workers, sweating, coughing, perhaps dying of fever, while the jungle crept back inch by inch until the last whistle blew and the last fire went out. When he returned home a week later, the air around his cabin felt different, heavier, as if the forest had been waiting. The moment he stepped onto the porch, he knew he could not stay away much longer. Knowledge was useless unless tested against the real thing. He would have to return, not as a wanderer, but as a witness. That night, he sat by the river, writing in his notebook. The entries grew more reflective now, his observations blending with thoughts he barely understood himself. The train had begun to stand for more than its own mystery. It was a symbol of the world's forgotten ambition, of men who believed they could master everything except time. Perhaps that was why he felt drawn to it, because he too lived on the edge of vanishing, his life dissolving quietly into the jungle's rhythm. Before extinguishing the lamp, he looked once more at the photograph of the locomotive, its rusted body gleaming faintly under his flashlight's beam. Tomorrow, he decided, he would return to it. He would follow the broken track, if only for a few meters more, to see whether the forest had left any other traces of those who came before. The forest outside seemed to murmur in approval, a low rustling that might have been wind or something older. Elias listened until his eyes closed. The rain began again soon after, soft and ceaseless, washing the air clean. Somewhere deep within the endless green, the train waited as it always had, patient beneath the weight of years, ready to yield another fragment of its buried story. When Elias returned to the jungle, it was as if no time had passed at all. The river flowed with the same slow patience. The trees leaned over the banks in the same silent vigil, and the air hung heavy with that familiar perfume of rot and life. Yet inside him, everything had changed. The journey to the city had filled him with information and theory, but none of it had quieted the question that still echoed inside his chest. He knew the train was not a hallucination, not a myth or a local legend. It was real, built by human hands, shipped across oceans, assembled here for a reason he still could not name. And now that he knew how deliberate its presence must have been, the need to see it again was irresistible. He prepared with greater care this time, packing supplies for several days, food, a small tent, new batteries, a brush for cleaning surfaces, and a camera with fresh film. As he set out, he felt almost calm, as though the forest itself expected his return. The first night he camped near a lagoon, the water shining faintly under the moonlight. The sounds of frogs and cicadas lulled him into sleep. But even in dreams he saw the locomotive, its silent face turned toward him, half buried in green earth, waiting for him to uncover what lay inside its dark heart. The second day's march was harder. The storm season had thickened the undergrowth, and each step was a battle with vines and mud. Yet when he finally reached the clearing, the sight that met him was almost tender. The train looked smaller than he remembered, softened by light. The air was dry, and dust floated where mist had been before. A few orchids had begun to bloom from the cracks in the metal, bright bursts of purple against the rust. Elias felt a strange affection for the machine, as if it were an old friend who had endured decades of pain without complaint. He unpacked his gear, set up a small tarp nearby, and spent the first hour simply walking around, reacquainting himself with the terrain. Everything was as he had left it, the ladder broken, the cab door ajar, the faint depression of the vanished rail. But there was something different, too. Near the rear of the train, where tangled roots had once blocked the passage, a patch of soil had shifted. Perhaps the last storm had loosened it. It was there he noticed a rectangular outline beneath the moss, a panel of metal half hidden in the dirt. He crouched down and brushed it clean. It looked like a hatch. He cleared more of the earth with the brush, revealing a handle so corroded it looked like a vine itself. When he pulled, nothing happened at first. He tried again, gripping it with both hands, and at last it gave a groan that vibrated through the ground. The hatch lifted a few inches before sticking again. The smell that rose from below was cold, dry, and metallic. Elias waited, letting the air settle before widening the opening. Beneath it was a set of steps descending into darkness. He hesitated, then turned on his flashlight. The beam cut through the black to reveal a narrow chamber lined with metal shelves. Dust floated thick as fog. It was a storage compartment, sealed off long ago and preserved by the weight of earth above it. Elias descended slowly, one hand on the wall. The air grew cooler. When his feet touched the floor, the sound echoed faintly, as if the space extended beyond the limits of his light. He swept the beam across the room and froze. Rows of wooden crates stood neatly stacked against the far wall, each sealed with rusted bands. On the nearest one, faint stenciled letters spelled out words he recognized. Botanisches Material, 1911. Botanical material. His heart began to pound. He approached and brushed away the dust. The lid resisted, but after a few careful strikes with the crowbar, it cracked open. Inside, nestled in straw that had turned brittle with age, were glass jars, dozens of them, each filled with fragments of dried plants. The labels were written in meticulous German script. Specimen A Extractum, Region 4. Some contained roots, others leaves or flowers preserved in a thick amber resin. Elias picked up one of the jars and held it to the light. The substance inside glimmered faintly, as though it had captured the sunlight from another century. He read the notes scrawled on the paper tucked beneath it. Chemical formulas, Latin names, the kind of notation used by scientists cataloging discoveries. His mind raced. If this was truly a scientific expedition, then this compartment was not just storage. It was a laboratory. The train had been more than transport. It had been a mobile research station. He explored further. In another crate, he found sealed envelopes made of waxed paper, each containing pressed plants wrapped in gauze. Some of the labels mentioned alkaloid concentrations and potential medical applications. Others simply said unbekannt, unknown. On the shelves were metal boxes filled with instruments, calipers, magnifying lenses, small knives, all carefully arranged. It was as if the researchers had planned to return, leaving everything in perfect order for their next session, but they never came back. Elias sat down on a crate, the weight of discovery pressing on him like the humid air above. He imagined the scene a century earlier, men in white shirts and suspenders moving through this same narrow space, cataloging specimens under the hum of lanterns, their voices echoing in German. He could almost hear their discussions, their excitement, their confidence that what they were doing mattered. And then, silence. Whatever happened to them had been final. He noticed a stack of rolled papers in a copper tube resting in the corner. The metal was still intact, polished by time rather than destroyed. He unscrewed the cap and carefully slid out the contents, maps, or what remained of them. They showed the interior of the Amazon, marked with red dots connected by faint lines. Each dot bore a number corresponding to a region, and at the bottom, a legend written in German described the coordinates. Elias traced them with his finger, realizing they stretched far beyond where he now stood. These were collection points, locations where the team had gathered specimens, but one of the circles was drawn heavier than the others, as if emphasized. It matched his current position exactly. He felt a thrill, followed by dread. This place had been their central station, their base of operations, which meant somewhere nearby must have been their camp, their living quarters, perhaps even the graves of those who never left. As he studied the map further, his flashlight flickered. He adjusted it, but the battery was fading. The beam dimmed to a weak glow. Reluctantly, he packed everything back into the tube, returned the jars to their crate, and climbed back up to the surface. When he pushed the hatch closed again, the sound echoed softly through the clearing, like the lid of a coffin. Evening had fallen by the time he sat beside the train again. The forest buzzed with life, indifferent to his revelation. He spread the map on the ground, weighing its corners with stones, and compared the red marks to his own notes. Many of them corresponded to regions now marked as protected zones, areas closed to exploration because of dangerous terrain or fragile ecosystems. Some were entirely uncharted. He thought of the letters Roberto had shown him, the hints of foreign interest, the disappearance of records. It all began to weave into something vast and unsettling. This was not a casual scientific trip. It had been an organized expedition, perhaps with government or corporate backing, designed to uncover resources the world was not yet ready to see. The fire crackled softly beside him, and in its light he studied the copper tube again. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far beyond what an improvised mission could afford. Whatever they had been searching for, they had the means to pursue it in secrecy. And yet, here it all ended, buried and forgotten. He leaned back against a tree, exhaustion slowly overtaken excitement. The forest around him pulsed with steady rhythm, the chorus of frogs, the whisper of leaves, the distant cry of a night bird. It felt timeless, unchanging. The thought came to him that the forest itself might have chosen to erase their presence, swallowing the evidence before it could reach the outside world. Not out of malice, but as a kind of defense, a reminder that some parts of the earth were never meant to be owned or catalogued. As the night deepened, Elias stared at the locomotive glowing faintly in the moonlight. It looked less like a machine now and more like a monument, an altar to human ambition, rusted and humbled. He thought of the scientists who had stood where he now sat, believing that discovery could outlast decay. They had tried to preserve pieces of life in glass, but life had preserved them instead, embedding their work within the endless growth of the jungle. He fell asleep beside the fire, his notebook resting on his chest, and dreamed of voices whispering in a language he couldn't understand. When morning came, the fire was ash, and sunlight streamed through the leaves like water. The train loomed silent behind him, unchanged, but the air felt heavier, charged with meaning. Elias spent the next day documenting everything he had found. He took careful photographs of the hatch, the interior, the jars, and the maps. He wrote down every label and translated as much as he could recall. His notes filled page after page, each word an attempt to rescue the forgotten from oblivion. Yet, as the hours passed, he began to sense that he was crossing a threshold. Knowledge was not neutral. It carried weight. The more he uncovered, the more responsible he felt for what this discovery might unleash if exposed. By late afternoon, his work was done. He packed his things, sealed the map back in its tube, and stood for a long moment in front of the train. The shadows stretched long and golden across the clearing. The forest murmured, as if content with his efforts. He whispered a quiet thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to the place itself, for allowing him to see what no one else had seen in 100 years. Then he turned away, walking back toward the faint path that led to the river. The locomotive faded behind him, its outline dissolving into vines and light. He didn't look back, though he could feel its presence at his back like a pulse. Somewhere, deep inside him, he knew that the secret he carried was no longer just the forest's. It was his, too, and it would follow him forever, as constant and unrelenting as the heartbeat of the jungle itself. The return journey felt longer than before, as if the weight of what Elias carried slowed the river itself. The copper tube with the map, the photographs, the notes, each item pressed against his consciousness like a secret too heavy to bear. The forest no longer seemed indifferent. It was alive, watchful, whispering around him as his canoe slipped through the current. Every sound, the cry of a bird, the crack of a branch, felt sharper, as if the jungle were waiting to see what he would do. He had brought its buried truth to light, and now the question was whether he would share it or let it sink back into the mud of time. By the time he reached his cabin, rain had begun again, steady and fine. The roof dripped at its usual corner, and the river outside swelled with brown water. Tupa greeted him with cautious joy, wagging his tail as if he, too, sensed the tension that filled his master's silence. Elias unpacked his gear slowly, placing the copper tube on the table beside his journal. The air smelled of wet wood and oil. For the first time since finding the train, he hesitated. He had always believed that discovery was meant to be shared, that knowledge was a torch to be passed on. But now he wasn't sure. He lit the lamp and unrolled the map, the red dots gleaming faintly in the warm glow. The markings seemed innocent, just ink on paper, but he knew what they represented: a network of hidden places, potential sites of extraction or exploitation. The labels mentioned specimens, compounds, and resources of high potential. Those phrases haunted him. If he turned this over to the authorities, or worse, to corporate interests, what would they do? They would come with machines and saws, cutting open the forest to dig for profit. The thought filled him with unease. That night, he tried to write his report. He began with dates and coordinates, a factual account of what he had seen. But as the words formed, they began to feel wrong, sterile. The jungle was not just data. It was alive, sacred in its silence. He could not reduce it to a file in some bureaucrat's drawer. He imagined men in suits reading his words with bright eyes, already calculating the cost of extraction. The thought made him close the notebook. He blew out the lamp and sat in darkness, listening to the rain. Sleep was restless. Dreams came heavy, the kind that seemed more memory than imagination. He saw the freight car again, the rows of jars glowing faintly in the flashlight beam. He heard voices murmuring in German, laughter, and then silence. The last thing he remembered before waking was the sound of metal groaning, a door closing forever. Morning light crept through the shutters, pale and watery. Elias rose with a dull headache and walked outside. The forest steamed under the sun, water dripping from every leaf. He breathed deeply, trying to steady himself. He told himself he was overthinking, that all he needed was perspective. Yet, when he sat again at the table, the map seemed to stare back at him like an accusation. He decided to speak to someone beyond the reach of local gossip. There was a small environmental office in Manaus, run by a woman named Carla, who had once worked with him on anti-logging patrols. She was one of the few he trusted. He radioed her frequency, his hand trembling slightly as he spoke. "Carla, it's Elias. I've found something. I need advice, maybe more than that." Her voice crackled through static. "You sound shaken. Are you hurt?" "No, just unsettled. It's hard to explain over the radio. It's about a discovery. Old, from before any of us." There was a pause. "If it's about protected land or illegal mining, you know the protocol." "It's not that," he said. "It's something that shouldn't exist." Silence filled the line. Then she replied carefully, "You should come here. Bring whatever you found. We'll look into it properly." Elias hesitated. The distance between his cabin and the city was more than miles. It was a gulf between worlds. In the city, facts became currency. Secrets became news. He thought of the jars, the plants labeled unbeckoned, the careful hands that had preserved them. Would they be dissected again, this time under fluorescent lights, for profit instead of knowledge? He thanked Carla, promised to consider it, and ended the transmission. The next few days passed in a haze. He wandered between the river and the forest edge, unable to focus on anything. His thoughts swung between pride and fear. What right did he have to keep this to himself? But what right did anyone have to claim it? One afternoon, he sat by the water with the copper tube across his knees. The reflection of the sun trembled on its surface like fire. He thought of dropping it into the river, letting it vanish beneath the current. But his hand froze. To destroy evidence felt as wrong as exploiting it. That night, the storm returned with fury. Thunder rolled across the sky, and the wind tore through the trees. The rain hammered the roof, drowning every sound except its own. Elias sat inside, holding the map flat against the table to keep it from fluttering. In the flicker of lightning, the red marks glowed like wounds. He realized suddenly that he could not undo what he had seen. The forest had chosen him as its witness, and witnesses carried burdens, not choices. When dawn came, the air smelled of renewal. The rain had stopped and mist clung low over the ground. Elias took his camera, his notes, and the copper tube and placed them neatly inside a waterproof case. He set it beneath his bed as if hiding something sacred. Then he left the cabin and began to walk without destination. The path led him back to the trees, their trunks slick with rain. He walked for hours until the sound of civilization faded completely. Only the jungle remained, its breath, its heartbeat, its timeless whisper. He sat beneath a giant kiba tree, the same kind that the old tribes called the mother of the forest. Its roots rose around him like walls. Closing his eyes, he listened. The rustle of leaves above became a language he almost understood. He felt small, not in fear, but in awe. Humanity was young here, temporary. The forest would outlast them all. It was then that he understood what he had to do. He would not destroy his findings, nor would he reveal them to the hungry machinery of progress. He would protect them, as the forest had done for a century. He would let time bury the truth again, but this time deliberately. He returned to the cabin and began his quiet work. He sealed the photographs and notes in plastic, wrapped the copper tube in cloth, and carried everything to a place upriver where the water was deep and still. There he found a hollow beneath a cluster of rocks, just above the current's reach. Carefully, he buried the case there, covering it with soil and moss. It was not an act of erasure, but of preservation. Someday, perhaps long after he was gone, someone else might find it. Someone who would approach it with the same reverence, not greed. When the task was done, Elias sat by the riverbank for a long time, watching the surface shimmer under the afternoon light. The water flowed endlessly, carrying leaves, seeds, and fragments of the forest toward the sea. He felt a quiet peace settle over him, a peace tinged with melancholy. For the first time in weeks, the constant hum in his mind subsided. He had made his choice, though it cost him something he could not name. In the evening, he returned home. The forest around his hut seemed unchanged, but he sensed it breathing with him now, less as a stranger and more as a companion. He cooked a simple meal, fed Tupa, and sat on the porch as darkness fell. The stars emerged one by one above the canopy, cold and sharp. The night air was thick with the smell of damp leaves. He thought of the train again, of its rusted frame slowly disappearing under the weight of vines. It, too, was at peace now, untouched by ambition or fear. He wondered if anyone else would ever find it. Perhaps, decades later, a new generation of explorers would stumble upon it and marvel at its mystery. Perhaps not. Either way, it would belong to the forest again, and that was enough. As he sat there, a flicker of light caught his eye, a firefly drifting near the riverbank. Then another and another until the night was alive with them, tiny lanterns weaving through the darkness. Elias smiled faintly. The jungle, indifferent yet eternal, continued its quiet symphony, and for the first time he felt himself not apart from it, but part of it. The secret no longer felt like a burden. It had transformed into something gentler, a promise between man and land, unspoken yet understood. Before going inside, he looked once more toward the unseen depths of the forest. He imagined the locomotive resting there, vines curling lovingly over its body, the sealed compartment below still filled with jars of unknown plants. The thought no longer haunted him. It was safe. Everything was as it should be. He whispered goodnight to the darkness and stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. That night, he dreamed not of iron or rust, but of roots and rain, of life weaving endlessly over what once was. When he woke in the gray light of dawn, the rain had returned, gentle and persistent. It fell on the river, on the hut, on the forest that guarded its own secrets. Elias stood at the window, feeling gratitude, and whispered to no one, "Let it rest." Outside, the jungle answered with silence, the kind that was not empty but full of memory, of time, of the slow breathing of the earth. He knew then that he had done the only thing that made sense. Some discoveries were not meant for museums or headlines. Some were meant to be kept by the soil, by the roots, by the rain. And so he let them go, trusting that the forest, in its infinite patience, would remember. Weeks passed, then months. The river rose and fell with the rhythm of the rain. The forest thickened, and the paths Elias once walked daily began to close in again, as if nature had decided to erase even his footprints. His days became quieter, his movements slower, his thoughts gentler. The weight of decision that had once pressed on him dissolved into the kind of peace that came only when one stopped fighting the inevitable. He had made his choice, to keep silence, and the jungle, vast and wordless, had accepted that pact. The world outside continued to turn, full of noise and ambition, but here time flowed differently. Each dawn felt eternal, and each night folded softly into the next. He still patrolled the edges of the reserve, still sent his routine reports about rainfall, soil, and the tracks of jaguars. Yet he no longer mentioned the train. The photographs remained locked in his mind, like a story written in invisible ink. Sometimes, in the middle of his work, he would stop and listen. The sound of a distant branch cracking or a rush of wind through the canopy would bring the memory back. The gleam of rust, the whisper of his boots on the metal floor, the quiet order of the sealed jars. But the recollection no longer unsettled him. It was simply there, a part of the forest song, inseparable from the sound of insects and the murmur of the river. The rains that year were longer than usual. Floodwaters climbed to the base of his hut, and for weeks he lived in a world of reflections, where trees seemed to rise from the sky itself. He spent his evenings mending tools, writing brief notes that would never leave his journal, and reading old field manuals by lantern light. Sometimes he spoke aloud to Tupa, who lay stretched at his feet, his muzzle graying now with age. The dog would lift his head and listen as if understanding, then rested again, content with the company of silence. When the weather cleared, Elias decided to revisit the riverbank where he had buried the copper tube. He had no reason to dig it up, no real purpose beyond reassurance. The path was damp but passable. The air carried the scent of wet clay and the sweet rot of leaves. He found the place easily. Nature had begun its slow work, moss covering the stones, but the mound still marked his careful handiwork. He stood there for a long time without touching it, feeling the stillness that surrounded him. There was no guilt, no regret, only a deep sense that what he had done was right. The world did not need more discoveries. It needed more guardians. On the way back, he stopped by a grove of towering trees where the light filtered through in narrow shafts, turning the air gold and green. The beauty of it struck him anew, as if he were seeing it for the first time. The forest was not silent here. It breathed in slow waves, a living ocean of roots and leaves. Every droplet, every flutter of wings seemed to affirm the choice he had made. He thought again of the men who had come before him, the German engineers and botanists who had built their impossible railway. They had tried to master the forest, to catalog and contain it. Yet, in the end, it had been the forest that mastered them, folding their efforts back into its own pulse. Perhaps, he thought, this was how things were meant to be. That night, Elias dreamed of them again. Not as ghosts or specters, but as travelers, faces he could not quite see, moving through the jungle with maps and lanterns. In his dream, he followed them to the clearing where the train stood, but it was not decayed or silent. It gleamed as if newly forged, its wheels clean, its boiler shining under the sun. He could hear voices speaking in a language he didn't know, but there was laughter in them, not fear. When he stepped closer, one of the men turned, smiled, and tipped his hat before vanishing into light. Elias woke with tears in his eyes, though he could not say why. He took the dream as a farewell. From that day, he never returned to the train. He knew the way there by heart, could have found it even blindfolded, but something in him understood that to visit again would disturb the delicate balance he and the forest had created. Instead, he let it fade into the green, as it had before him, as it surely would after. The years rolled on. The forest continued its slow, relentless work. Roots deepened, vines thickened, and the river carved new bends in the land. A few younger rangers arrived in the district, men who looked at Elias with a kind of puzzled respect. He had become a fixture, as constant as the trees themselves. They asked him for stories, but he gave them only the usual ones, of storms and animals, of the time he had rescued a lost trader or found a hidden waterfall. He never mentioned the train, though sometimes, when the firelight flickered across his face, his eyes took on a distant gleam that made the others fall silent without knowing why. In his solitude, Elias began to notice small signs of change. Certain plants bloomed where they never had before. New birds appeared along the riverbanks. Once, he saw a vine whose leaves resembled the ones he had glimpsed in those jars beneath the train. The resemblance was uncanny. He studied it carefully, noting its shape and color, but made no entry in his records. Some things, he knew now, were best left unmeasured. The forest had its own ways of keeping what belonged to it. One afternoon, after a long patrol, he stopped at a rise overlooking the endless canopy. The air was still, shimmering with heat. From that height, the world looked like a single living organism, green waves stretching beyond the horizon. He thought of the train sleeping beneath those layers of life, of the sealed jars resting in darkness. Perhaps, he mused, the forest had absorbed their contents, spreading those unknown species through its veins until they became part of its own body. Perhaps nothing was truly lost, only transformed. The thought comforted him. He had always feared oblivion, the idea that things could disappear completely. But here, surrounded by the oldest living system on Earth, he understood that nothing vanished. It only changed shape. The iron of the train was becoming soil, the glass of the jars, sand, the stories of the men, whispers in the leaves, and he too would one day join that cycle. When his health began to falter, he felt no panic. He grew thinner, slower, his hair silvering like moonlight, but his eyes remained bright. He spent more time sitting by the river, Tupa beside him, the two of them silent companions waiting for the evening breeze. Some nights, when the stars hung low and the air smelled of rain, he thought he could almost hear the faint echo of a whistle carried through the forest, a sound softer than memory, older than time. He would smile then, certain it was only wind, though a small part of him hoped otherwise. He left no letters, no confession, no coordinates. When the day finally came and his body was found by the younger rangers weeks later, they noted the serenity on his face, the notebook open beside him. Its last page contained no words, only a single line drawn across it, a simple curve like the bend of a railway disappearing into the horizon. They buried him near the river, beneath a tree whose roots spread wide into the earth. The forest accepted him without ceremony, covering the grave with leaves and rain. Seasons turned. Years followed, blurring into one another. The hut by the river fell into ruin, the roof collapsing, the floor reclaimed by moss. Tupa's descendants roamed the banks, wild and free. The young rangers came and went, new ones taking their place. The copper tube remained hidden beneath the stones where Elias had placed it, untouched, waiting for whoever might come after. And deep in the forest, where no human step had sounded in decades, the train slept on. Its body was almost gone now, consumed by roots and soil. Trees grew through its frame, their trunks bending around the rusted metal. The compartments were filled with earth and insects, the last fragments of glass glinting faintly like dew. Yet, beneath the surface, in the sealed chamber Elias had once discovered, the jars endured. The labels had faded, but the specimens inside remained preserved, their forms suspended in time. Above them, the jungle thrived, a cathedral of green built on the bones of iron. Sometimes at dusk, when the wind shifted, the clearing around the old locomotive seemed to hum faintly, as though remembering. The forest kept its own stories. It told them not with words, but with growth, with vines twisting over forgotten machines, with leaves sprouting from the cracks of man's inventions. It remembered Elias, too, though not by name. It remembered the quiet footsteps, the careful hands that had chosen respect over revelation. And so the forest kept its promise. The train stayed buried, the map unseen, the secret intact. The rain continued its endless descent, softening every sharp edge until all things blended into one: the man, the machine, the land. In the end, there was no boundary between them, only the hum of life enduring, ancient and unbroken. If one day a traveler were to stumble upon that place again, they would find nothing but trees, roots, and silence. No rails, no rust, no sign of the hand that once uncovered it. Yet, perhaps, if they stood very still and listened long enough, they might hear something in the air, a faint metallic echo, the memory of a whistle far away, carried by the wind through the canopy. And they would feel, without knowing why, that something vast had happened there long ago, something the forest had chosen to remember in its own way. For the forest does not forget. It waits, it heals, it hides. It keeps what is given to it, folding stories into soil, turning secrets into roots. And somewhere beneath the green eternity, the heart of iron still sleeps, embraced by the same silence that once called a solitary man to listen, to discover, and finally, to let go. If this story kept you watching till the end, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There are more unbelievable true mysteries waiting for you. Don't miss the next video. It might just change how you see the world. And if this one gave you chills, share it with a friend who loves a good mystery too.